was sort of he was not one of the people who was sort of going to play the game. He was not a guy who was going to sort of play nicey nice with his superiors or anything like that. He was actually rather quiet and kind of sullen, and actually did drink a decent amount, although not when he was actually on duty, which is somewhat of a myth. Some people actually was had said there were rumors spread at the time that he was drunk, during various battles, and that's not the case. Anyway, the notoriety Grant gained in the West would eventually serve him well. Although after Shiloh, he actually was, for a while, returned back to desk duty, not allowed to command an army in the field because he'd allowed his army to be surprised and because he'd lost so many people. Well, by 1862, by the summer of 1862, even before Antietam, Abraham Lincoln had already decided that he was going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, the idea of actually freeing slaves. And however, he is begged. Remember, Lincoln had started this war and had run as president, and started the war under the idea of that this war was a war about keeping the Union together, and that was it. This was not a war about freeing slaves. In fact, he's famous for saying, if I could restore the Union and free all the slaves, I would do it. If I could restore the Union and free none of the slaves, I would do it. If I could restore the Union and free some of the slaves while others remained in bondage, I would do that too. Okay, he actually said that. However, by 1862, for several reasons, Grant had come to the decision to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. One of which was just that, the South had this kind of cause of creating a nation and protecting their homes from an invading Northern Army. Because other than Lee's invasion of Maryland, and then in 1863 he invades Pennsylvania, most of this war is fought on Southern soil. And so Southerners are sort of defending their own hearth and homes, defending their families and this sort of stuff. And that's a very powerful motivation. Whereas the idea of sort of keeping the Union together was, somewhat nebulous in the minds of many Northerners. And so, for one of the reasons that Grant decided to issue an Emancipation Proclamation was to sort of ennoble the war, to give it a higher cause, to make it now a war about making men free, to give it a sort of moral cause. The other thing is that Grant's own thinking about African Americans, about blacks, had changed. Largely due to his interactions with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass ceaselessly lobbied Lincoln. I mean, every time he could find him, it almost got to the point where Lincoln almost hid from him on certain days when he just had too much on his plate and didn't want to deal with Douglass. Because Douglass, ceaselessly, tirelessly lobbied Lincoln to free slaves, to arm them, to allow them to fight, as you saw in the film, some of the quotes from Frederick Douglass. And so Lincoln became so impressed by Douglass, mainly because Douglass was very much his intellectual equal, and here was someone that was sort of living proof to Lincoln that blacks and whites, were equal and deserved an equal chance, and created equal. And so Lincoln tells his cabinet in the summer before Antietam that he's going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation that will free the slaves. His cabinet tells him, okay, but you cannot do it now because we're losing this war at this point. And if you do this, it will just seem like the sort of the last act of a desperate man. And so Lincoln holds off. They tell him to wait for a victory. Well, Antietam's not technically a victory, but it does stop the southern invasion of Maryland. And so for Lincoln, this is good enough. And so in September of 1862, not long after Antietam, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which says this, that on January 1st, 1863, all persons held in bondage in any state now in open rebellion against this government are henceforth and forever free. So technically, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave, okay? It only applies to those states in open rebellion against the U.S. government. It does not apply to slaves in places like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, where there were slaves, but those states would remain loyal to the Union, okay? It only applies to the states of the Confederacy. Well, of course, the Confederacy doesn't recognize Abraham Lincoln as their president, and so certainly in terms of immediate impact, it doesn't free anyone, okay? But it's an extremely savvy political move in that, one of the things that Lincoln's cabinet worried about and his advisors worried about was if you free the slaves in places like Missouri and Maryland and Kentucky, you're going to drive those states, which were called border states, states that were very much on the border between the North and the South and were sort of teetering between, leaving the Union or not. It will drive them into this Confederate camp. And so, therefore, by making the Emancipation Proclamation not apply to those states yet, it was a sort of a way to keep them in the Union. But in addition, though, the Emancipation Proclamation is extremely important symbolically because it certainly does place the war on that higher plane, because it basically is a signal by Lincoln that when this war is over, if the Union wins, the end result, you can't have, only those slaves in the states that rebelled, okay? And certainly if the Union wins, all those slaves will be free. It's sort of a signal that certainly the end of slavery is coming. And if a Union victory is the result of this war, slavery will be over, will be abolished. And so it's extremely important symbolically, even if technically it doesn't free a single slave, okay? And very much the war reaches a turning point in July of 1863. And that is the Battle of Gettysburg, which is fought in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on July 1st through the 3rd, 1863. And what happens is, once again, Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, as they had the last fall in September of 1862, in July of 1863, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia invade Pennsylvania. And the Union Army, moves to try to stop them. And at one point, Robert Lee sends. They don't plan. Neither army planned to fight at Gettysburg, but over sort of Robert E. Lee sends a small detachment of troops to Gettysburg to capture some shoes that are being made there or held there for the U.S. Army, for the Union Army. There happens to be some Union cavalry in the area. They come across each other, they start to fight, and eventually, before you know it, the entire armies of both sides have shown up, and a fight is on. And one of the things that's different about Gettysburg than almost every other battle fought in the East between the Union and the Confederacy is that at Gettysburg, the Union managed to seize the best ground first. And what I mean by this is they managed to seize a series of hills outside the town that look down on the town. And so therefore the Confederates were going to have to be attacking them uphill the whole way. And at Gettysburg, rather than retreat as he was advised to by many of his staff, because Lee's army was of course smaller than that of the Union, Lee decided to dig in and try to end the war in this one fight, rather than sort of live to fight another day and fight on ground of his own choosing. And over 3 days, in the largest battle ever fought on American soil. There are over 165,000 troops involved in the Battle of Gettysburg. And in that battle, Robert E. Lee, or first let's say this, by the time it's over, Lee he's not able to drive the Union from those hills, no matter how he tries, okay? In the end, the Union loses about 20,000 men. Lee and the Confederates lose 25,000. The problem is that 25,000 that Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia lose, that represents more than 1/3 of Lee's entire army. And after Gettysburg, the Confederacy is never again able to invade the North. And hence, this is why the Battle of Gettysburg is referred to as sort of the turning point of the war. Now, it's not easy for the North, as we'll see, to finish the war. It's not like it ends right after the Battle of Gettysburg. But certainly this is a major, major blow to the South and completely destroys the South's ability to fight the war on the offensive, to take the war to the North. For the rest of the war, the South is solely fighting to defend its territory as the North invades. In fact, to make things worse, far to the west, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is a key port, which if the Union captures that, they'll basically control all the rest of the Mississippi because they already control the areas to the north of that, and they control New Orleans. So Vicksburg is sort of the last stronghold for the South on the Mississippi River. Ulysses S. Grant had been besieging Vicksburg for weeks and weeks and had not been able to break the city's defenses. on the next day after the Battle of Gettysburg, which occurs in the East, which is this